It's 1:47 a.m. You have a deadline at 9 and you're staring at a blank document like it personally offended you. So you do what a growing number of people now do instinctively. You open an AI tab, you type a prompt that starts with write me an essay about, and within seconds a clean, coherent answer appears, which feels like magic until you notice something uncomfortable. Because you didn't think your way to that paragraph, you didn't even walk alongside it. You more or less watched it arrive. And the scary part is how quickly your brain learns that this is an option. Now, let's scale that one moment up, not just to students, but to anyone writing emails, summarizing meetings, generating ideas, planning travel, navigating cities, arithmetic, spelling, even deciding what to cook. We're not just using tools anymore, we're outsourcing the micro struggles that used to train our minds. And that leads to a question that sounds like clickbait but refuses to go away. Is AI making us dumber? This sort of question, this sort of panic, is ancient because the first recorded version of this argument basically begins with kids these days can't memorize anything. Except it was Socrates saying it about writing. He worried that if people could store knowledge externally, they would stop exercising memory. They would gain the appearance of wisdom without the substance of it. And in hindsight, that looks ridiculous because writing didn't destroy intelligence, it scaled it. It allowed civilization to build cumulative knowledge, laws, science, and literature. And yet, Socrates wasn't completely wrong either, because writing did change what we trained. It reduced the need for memorizing epics, and it shifted intelligence toward analysis, synthesis, and long form reasoning. So the question isn't whether tools change the brain, they always have. The real question is what exactly is being changed, what is being lost, what is being gained, and whether we're drifting into that change unconsciously because AI is not just another calculator. It's closer to a general purpose cognitive assistant, and that matters. To understand why, we need to talk about something psychologists call cognitive offloading, which is basically the mental version of putting your bags down because your arms are tied. You delegate a task to the environment, a notebook holds your to do list, Google holds your facts, GPS holds your route, autocorrect holds your spelling. And the point is not that this is inherently bad, the point is that the brain adapts to what it repeatedly does, and also to what it repeatedly stops doing. One of the cleanest examples is memory, not the dramatic I forgot who I am kind, but the everyday substrate of thinking. The background store that lets you connect ideas quickly because memory isn't separate from intelligence. It's the scaffolding intelligence climbs on. Back in 2011, researchers demonstrated what became known as the Google effect. When people believe information will be available later, they remember less of the information itself and instead remember where to find it, which is a rational optimization. Except there's a cost. Because if you don't internalize knowledge, your ability to reason deeply can become shallow, not because you're incapable, but because you're constantly thinking with rented furniture. Let's take another example. For example, navigation, which sounds trivial until you realize that spatial memory is tightly linked to the hippocampus, a brain region heavily involved in memory formation and cognitive mapping. And modern navigation has become a masterclass in offloading, because most of us don't navigate anymore. We obey. We follow turn by turn instructions like a human forklift. And neuroscientists have found that heavy GPS use correlates with worse performance on spatial memory tasks, while longitudinal evidence suggests that increased reliance can track with steeper decline in hippocampal dependent spatial memory over time, which implies something like use it or lose it, except that it is a mental map. There's even work showing that when drivers follow satnav, key regions involved in navigation and planning show reduced activity compared with when people navigate actively. And at the other extreme, you get London taxi drivers, famous for training the knowledge, who have been observed to show hippocampal differences consistent with intense spatial training, which is basically the brain confessing in biological terms that it becomes what you repeatedly demand of it. Thus far, none of this is uniquely AI. It's automation, it's convenience, it's offloading. And you might argue this is just progress. Because who cares if we memorize roots when we can spend the mental energy on high level thought? And that argument is real. Except generative AI changes the stakes because it doesn't just offload retrieval or navigation, it offloads composition, reasoning scaffolds, and the messy intermediate steps where learning usually happens. Here's the uncomfortable evidence point that made a lot of academics sit up. An MIT Media Lab experiment had participants write essays under different conditions. One group wrote with no tools, one used a search engine, and one used an AI assistant. And brain activity measured with EEG showed the highest and most widespread engagement in the no tools group, moderate engagement with search, and the weakest connectivity with AI assistants. And the eerie part is what happened later, because when the AI was removed, habitual AI users struggled to recall or quote what they had written, as if the task had been completed without being metabolized into memory. And the researchers described this risk as cognitive debt, meaning you borrow ease now and pay later. You pay in reduced learning and reduced independent performance. To be fair, this kind of study has limits. Samples can be small and context can be artificial. And as well as EEG is not a magic intelligence meter. But the directional story makes sense because if you skip the effortful part of cognition, you skip the part that usually builds durable skill. And in education, especially, that effortful part is the entire point. This is where the debate gets moralized because it's easy to say students are cheating, but the deeper issue is habit formation. Because if the default response to difficulty becomes ask the model, then over years you risk training a reflex of avoidance. And that is not just about school, it's about whether you still have the patience for slow thought, whether you can tolerate ambiguity without instantly collapsing it into a neat paragraph. And AI doesn't just reduce effort, it can subtly shape the form of what we produce, because language models are statistical machines that often converge on the most common phrasing. Which brings us to something almost comically small but psychologically huge: predictive text. A Harvard linked study on predictive text systems found that when people wrote with AI suggestions, their writing became shorter and more generic, not because they became worse writers overnight, but because the interface nudged them to accept the path of least resistance. And that nudging matters, because once you accept the generic framing, you often stop searching for the precise detail, the unusual adjective, the slightly risky sentence that actually contains your voice. So, as you get a world where outputs are competent yet strangely soulless, where everyone's cover letter sounds like everyone else's cover letter, where the average rises but the texture flattens, and the tragedy is that you might not even notice it's happening because it feels efficient, and efficiency is a persuasive drug. At this point, people usually jump to creativity and they either panic, AI will kill art, or they celebrate, AI will democratize creativity. And annoyingly, both camps have evidence. On the productivity side, large scale observational research in AI assisted art communities found that after adopting generative tools, creators often became more productive and received more engagement, while average novelty could decline slightly, which is exactly what you'd expect from a tool that makes it easy to generate attractive images and popular styles. And yet, the most original creators still produced highly novel work, sometimes even increasing peak originality, because the tool didn't replace their taste, it accelerated their iteration loop. In writing, too, experiments have shown AI suggestions can raise the floor, especially for less experienced writers, producing stories judged as more creative and enjoyable than average. But there's a catch. Collective diversity can shrink if everyone draws from the same suggestion engine. So the system improves individual output while homogenizing the cultural pool, which is like giving everyone the same set of good ideas and then acting surprised when originality becomes rare. Then you get these fascinating cases where AI seems to act like a cognitive sparring partner. For example, studies in design and architecture have suggested generative systems can help professionals explore broader solution spaces. sometimes producing more structurally innovative outcomes while still meeting constraints. And in some contexts, users show improved divergent thinking afterward, as if collaboration teaches new patterns of exploration, which hints at something optimistic, that AI can augment thinking rather than replace it, but only if the human stays active in the loop. So, how do we reconcile this? How can the same technology be associated with cognitive atrophy in one context and creative augmentation in another? And the answer is frustratingly simple. It depends on how it's used, whether it's a crutch or a tool for growth, because the difference is not AI or no AI, it's whether your brain remains the one doing the meaning making. This is why education researchers keep returning to the same principle. No learning occurs unless the brain is actively engaged. And if you use AI to generate an answer you never interrogate, you are essentially consuming a conclusion without building the reasoning that makes conclusions transferable. Whether if you use AI like a tutor, asking for hints, requesting counterarguments, forcing it to explain its steps, then you are still doing the cognitive work. You are just doing it with scaffolding. The most practical way to frame this metacognition, which is a fancy term for thinking about your thinking, and it turns out that metacognition is the difference between people who use AI and get smarter and the people who use AI and get lazier. Because strategic users pause and ask, what's the task? What do I already know? Where am I weak? What would count as a good answer? And how will I verify it? While passive users ask for output and then accept it as reality. You can also see this around AI coding assistants too, where novices using an assistant can perform better and feel lower cognitive load. Where novices using an AI assistant can perform better and feel lower cognitive load. Not because they learn nothing, but because they could iterate faster, test ideas, and receive feedback. Crucially, they still had to decide what to accept and what to reject, meaning they were learning a collaboration skill rather than outsourcing entirely. So, if you zoom out, you land on what some scholars call the cognitive atrophy paradox. AI can augment high level thinking by handling low level tasks, and at the same time, it can erode skills through disuse if it becomes a replacement rather than an amplifier. And this paradox isn't a bug, it's the default outcome of powerful tools meeting human laziness. Which brings us to the part everyone avoids. What do you actually do about it? Because being mindful is not a strategy. First, you protect fundamentals. Not because we worship old school methods, but because deep knowledge is what lets you notice when AI is wrong, and also what lets you ask better questions. Because the quality of your prompts is bounded by the quality of your understanding. And without internal knowledge, you become dependent on external fluency, which is how you get confident nonsense that you can't detect. Second, you design friction back into your life, which sounds anti technology until you realize friction is often where skill lives. So you occasionally navigate without GPS. You occasionally draft without autocomplete. You occasionally do retrieval practice instead of instant lookup. Because the point is not to suffer, the point is to keep the cognitive muscles recruited. Thirdly, and this is the most important, you use AI in a way that forces you to stay agentic, meaning you don't ask for the final answer. You ask for a structure and then you fill it. You ask for counter arguments and then you decide. You ask it to critique your work and then you revise. Treat it like an adversarial tutor, not an oracle, because the moment you treat it like an oracle, you stop being a thinker and start being a dispatcher. And finally, you build AI literacy, not just how to use it, but what it is. Which means understanding that models can fabricate, that they optimize plausibility rather than truth, that they can reflect the average patterns of language rather than the sharp edge of insight, and that your job is to verify, contextualize, and judge, because those are human tasks that do not get outsourced without consequences. So, is AI making us dumber? The most honest answer is that AI is making it easier to live without exercising certain forms of intelligence. And for many people, that will look like being dumber in practice. Weaker memory for facts, weaker tolerance for complexity, weaker originality in expression, and weaker critical thinking habits. Not because their brains shrank overnight, but because the defaults changed. And yet, at the same time, AI is also making it possible to think at scales that were previously inaccessible, to prototype ideas faster, to learn with personalized feedback, to explore wider solution spaces, and to collaborate with a tool that never gets tired, which means it can also make us smarter, but only for those who insist on staying mentally involved. In other words, AI doesn't decide whether you think, it offers you the option not to. And the future will be determined by how often we take that option. Because the real threat is not that machines become intelligent, it's that humans become comfortable.